My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 32 years old, and I spend most of my days rebuilding old pickup trucks in a garage that sits behind a faded gas station on the south side of Cedar Ridge, Missouri. The place smells like gasoline, rust, and burnt coffee, and the radio only works when you slap it hard enough. People around town know me as the mechanic who works too late and talks too little. What they don't know is that every Thursday night, no matter how tired I am, I close the garage at 7, drive 3 miles to Miller's Family Grill, and sit in the same booth near the back window. I always order 2 bowls of chicken stew and 2 slices of cornbread. The second meal used to belong to my fiancée, Rachel. She died 4 years ago when a drunk driver crossed the center line and hit her car head-on while she was driving home from visiting her mother. We had eaten at Miller's almost every Thursday since we were 23. She always crumbled half her cornbread into the stew and laughed at me for eating the carrots first. After the funeral, I stopped doing a lot of things, but I never stopped going to that diner. The waitress, Linda, had long ago stopped asking whether someone else was joining me. She simply placed the second bowl across from me and set an extra spoon beside it, like she understood that some habits aren't about food at all. That Thursday night, rain was sliding down the windows in crooked silver lines, and the diner was nearly empty except for an older couple near the register and a trucker drinking coffee by the door. I stared at the untouched bowl across from me and wondered, as I often did, how long a person could keep pretending that grief was the same thing as loyalty. I had just lifted my spoon when the front door opened and a blast of cold wind swept through the diner. A woman stepped inside, holding the hand of a little girl who couldn't have been older than 7. The woman's coat was soaked through, her dark hair stuck to her cheeks, and the child's sneakers were so wet they squeaked against the floor. They paused just inside the doorway, both of them shivering. Linda walked over with a tired smile. "Table for 2. The woman swallowed hard before answering. "Actually, could we just sit for a few minutes until the rain slows down?" Linda's expression changed. "Honey, I'm sorry, but my boss doesn't like people taking tables if they're not ordering." The little girl tightened her grip on the woman's hand and whispered, "Mom, I'm hungry." The woman closed her eyes for a second, embarrassed enough that I wanted to look away. Then she said quietly, "I understand. We'll leave." Before they could turn around, my eyes drifted to the second bowl of stew sitting untouched across from me, steam still curling from the surface. I thought about the thousands of dollars worth of food I had thrown away over 4 years because I couldn't bear to stop ordering for someone who would never come back. Something in me moved before my mind had time to argue with it. I stood up, nodded toward the empty seat across from me, and said, "You don't have to leave. Please, sit here for a while." The woman looked at me as if she wasn't sure whether I was speaking to her or someone standing behind her, and for a moment I could see the battle happening in her eyes, the instinct to protect her dignity fighting against the exhaustion that had already taken almost everything else from her. The little girl kept staring at the bowl of stew across from me, her lips pressed tightly together the way hungry children do when they're trying not to ask for food again. I pulled the empty chair back a little farther and said, "It's too cold to stand outside with a child. Please, just sit down." Linda glanced at me, then at the untouched second bowl, and quietly brought another glass of water without saying a word. The woman finally nodded once, slowly, and guided the girl to the booth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough from either crying or the cold. "I'm sorry to intrude." "You're not intruding," I said, sliding the second bowl toward the child. "Go ahead." The girl looked immediately to her mother for permission. When the woman gave the smallest nod, the child picked up the spoon with both hands and began eating carefully at first, then faster when she realized no one was going to take it away. Watching her eat hit me harder than I expected. For years I had been feeding a memory, now that same meal was keeping a real child from going to bed hungry. The woman sat stiffly across from me, hands wrapped around the water glass as if it were the only warm thing she had touched all day. "I'm Sarah Bennett," she said after a long silence. "This is Lily." "Ethan." Lily paused just long enough to mumble, "Thank you, Mr. Ethan," before taking another spoonful. Sarah's eyes filled with tears so quickly that she turned her face toward the window. I pretended not to notice. After a few minutes I asked gently, "Do you two have somewhere to stay tonight?" Her fingers tightened around the glass. That hesitation told me everything before she answered. "We were supposed to stay with a friend," she said carefully, "but that didn't work out." It was the kind of sentence people use when the truth is too painful to hand to a stranger all at once. Outside, the rain was getting heavier, and the weather report on the diner television was warning of temperatures dropping below freezing before midnight. I thought about the small office behind my garage. It wasn't much, just a couch that folded out into a bed, a space heater, and a bathroom with a shower that only had hot water if you let it run for a minute first, but it was dry, warm, and safe. The idea formed in my mind before I had fully decided whether it was wise. "I've got a room behind my garage," I said. Sarah looked up immediately, alarm flashing across her face. "No, we can't ask you for that." "You didn't ask," I replied. "I'm offering. Just for tonight. Lily needs a warm place to sleep." Lily had finished every drop of stew and was now fighting to keep her eyes open. Sarah looked at her daughter, then back at me, and I could see how badly she wanted to refuse, how many times trusting the wrong person had probably cost her dearly. Finally, with a shaky breath, she whispered, "Just tonight." I paid the bill, and when we stepped out into the cold rain, Lily stumbled from exhaustion. Without thinking, I picked her up, and she rested her head against my shoulder almost instantly. As I carried her toward my truck, Sarah walked beside me in silence, watching me with an expression that held equal parts gratitude, fear, and the faintest trace of hope she was afraid to believe in. The room behind my garage looked even smaller when I opened the door that night, but when the heater clicked on and warm air began pushing back the cold, Sarah's shoulders relaxed for the first time since I had met her. I laid Lily on the fold-out couch, covered her with the thickest blanket I owned, and started to leave so they could have some privacy, but Sarah stopped me softly near the doorway. "Ethan, why are you doing this?" I looked at the sleeping child, her damp hair spread across the pillow, and answered with the only truth I had. "Because I know what it feels like when the world suddenly becomes too heavy to carry by yourself." I left them there and went upstairs to the tiny apartment above the garage, yet sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about the second bowl of stew and how different it had felt watching someone actually need it. The next morning, I came downstairs expecting them to be gone, but instead I found Sarah in the garage sweeping the concrete floor with an old push broom she had found leaning against the wall. "You don't have to do that," I said. She pushed a strand of hair behind her ear and gave me a tired half smile. "I can't just keep taking from you." Lily sat on an overturned milk crate nearby, drawing flowers on a scrap of cardboard with a mechanic's pencil. Over the next few days, one night somehow became several. Sarah found temporary work helping at a grocery store deli across town, and Lily stayed at the garage after school because Sarah's shifts ended later than the after-school program. At first Lily barely spoke, but children are naturally curious, and curiosity eventually breaks through fear. One afternoon she pointed at the old blue Ford the first was rebuilding and asked, "Why are all the parts spread out instead of staying on the truck?" I laughed quietly. "Because sometimes you have to take something apart before you can figure out how to make it run again." She considered that very seriously, as if it were the most important mechanical lesson she had ever heard. After that, she followed me around the garage asking endless questions about spark plugs, tires, paint colors, and why engines sounded different when they were healthy. The silence that had filled the building for years slowly began to change. One evening, after Lily had fallen asleep with her coloring book open on her chest, Sarah and I sat on folding chairs outside the garage while the summer insects buzzed under the yellow security light. For a long time neither of us spoke. Finally she said, "Lily's father left when she was 2. Last month the apartment complex raised the rent again, and I couldn't keep up. I've been staying with friends, shelters, wherever I could find a few days at a time." She stared out into the dark parking lot before adding, "I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I just don't want you thinking we're the kind of people who make a habit of living off strangers." "I don't think that," I said. She turned toward me, eyes shining with exhaustion. "Then what do you think?" The honest answer surprised me because I hadn't admitted it even to myself yet. I think you're doing everything you can to keep your daughter safe. Sarah looked down at her hands, and when she spoke again her voice was barely above a whisper. Most people only see the part where I'm failing. The word settled heavily between us. I wanted to tell her that I knew something about carrying invisible wounds, about waking up every day convinced that one terrible loss had permanently defined you, but before I could say anything, headlights swept across the garage door. A dark pickup truck rolled slowly into the lot and stopped near the entrance. Sarah's face lost all its color. She stood so quickly that her chair nearly tipped over, and in a frightened whisper that made my stomach tighten, she said, "Ethan, that's him." The truck's engine idled for a few seconds before the driver's door swung open, and a tall man in a worn leather jacket stepped out with the slow confidence of someone who expected the world to move out of his way. Sarah had already backed toward the garage door, her breathing shallow, her eyes locked on him with a fear that was far too practiced to be new. "Take Lily upstairs," she whispered. "Who is he?" I asked, though I already knew the answer mattered less than the terror on her face. "His name is Travis Mercer," she said. "We were engaged before Lily was born. When he drinks, he gets mean. I left for a reason." Travis walked closer, glancing from Sarah to me and then toward the garage as if inspecting property he believed belonged to him. "So this is where you've been hiding," he said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of alcohol. "Lily deserves better than sleeping in garages with strangers." Sarah's hands shook, but she stood her ground. "You lost the right to talk about what Lily deserves a long time ago." His expression hardened. "I'm taking my daughter." That was enough. I stepped between them. "She doesn't want to go with you." Travis laughed, but there was nothing friendly in it. "And who are you supposed to be?" "The man telling you to leave." For a moment I thought he might swing at me right there in the parking lot, but instead he pointed a finger toward Sarah. "You can't keep running forever," he snapped. "I'll come back with a lawyer if I have to." Then he climbed back into the truck and peeled out of the lot, tires squealing against the wet pavement. The silence afterward felt almost louder than the confrontation. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, and I could see that she was trying not to fall apart in front of me. "He's bluffing," she said, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than me. "Maybe," I replied, "but you shouldn't have to handle this alone anymore." Upstairs, Lily had woken up and was sitting on the couch rubbing her eyes. "Was that Daddy?" she asked quietly. Sarah knelt in front of her and pulled her into a tight hug. "Everything's okay," she whispered, though tears were already slipping down her cheeks. Later that night, after Lily fell asleep again, Sarah sat at my small kitchen table staring at a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. "I almost kept driving the night we came to the diner," she admitted. "I thought if I stopped moving, he'd find us." I sat across from her and said, "You stopped because you were exhausted, not because you were weak." She looked up at me then, really looked at me, and something changed in the quiet between us. "You know," she said softly, "when you slid that bowl of stew across the table, I thought it was just a meal. I didn't realize it was the first moment in months that someone treated me like I mattered." My chest tightened. For years I had been sitting across from an empty seat, convinced that my life had ended with Rachel's. Now, in a tiny apartment above a noisy garage, with rain tapping against the windows and a frightened woman trusting me enough to tell the truth, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. Grief had taught me how deeply a person could hurt, but kindness was teaching me that even a heart that had been broken for years could still become a safe place for someone else. Sarah reached across the table and took my hand, and for the first time since Rachel died, the future no longer looked like an empty booth waiting for someone who would never walk through the door again.